Hi everyone, Shabbat Shalom. While it has certainly been very hard to be apart, I can say it's been wonderful to start to get into a bit of a routine as we begin to learn the ropes of how each of us can start to connect with each other virtually. And it's hard to believe that Pesach is just a few days away. So please continue to be in touch with myself, like so many of you already have, to see how we can help make this Pesach as meaningful as ever. Please be on the lookout for more recorded shiurim, articles, and other resources to print out before Pesach. You know, in many ways, it's fitting that this week's Parsha continues the discussion of the different korbanos, the different sacrifices that were offered in the Mishkan, given the many, many sacrifices that we are all making during this uncertain time. In fact, this week's Parsha, unlike Parshat Vayikra, which focused on what or which korban was to be offered, this week we actually focus on how these different korbanos were actually offered by Aaron and his children, by the Kohanim. And in fact, we find another interesting parallel to what we are experiencing today, where we find that as part of the Miluim, as part of the ritual which inaugurated the Mishkan and the Kohanim, that Aaron and his sons were unable to leave the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, for 7 days. Upetach Ohel Moed Teshvu Yomam B'Laila Shivat Yamim. That God tells Aaron that he and his children need to isolate themselves. They need to socially distance from the rest of the Jewish people for 7 days. And while we know why it's so important for us today to maintain our social distance, to flatten the curve, how it's literally a matter of life and death, why was it so important for the Kohanim to socially distance themselves for 7 days and 7 nights? Why was it so important for them to stay away from the rest of the Jewish people for so long? And so perhaps we can suggest a very basic and yet maybe obvious answer, which relates to the idea that God is actually trying to protect the Kohanim from outside threats, such as Tumah and other ritual impurities, which might render the Kohanim unfit to serve. In fact, we actually see a very similar idea when it comes to the Kohen Gadol. The first Mishnah in Yoma teaches us that Shivat Yamim Kodem Yom Kippurim Mafrishin Kohen Gadol Mebeito, that we see that the Kohen Gadol for 7 days in advance of Yom Kippur, that he would remove himself from his home and he would go to the chamber of the counselors. And why? The Mishnah concludes, Shema Yarabo Psul, lest he become impure, lest he become disqualified from being able to lead the Yom Kippur service. And perhaps in the same way that the Kohen Gadol needed a 7-day quarantine in advance of Yom Kippur, the Kohanim perhaps also needed to remain tahor for those 7 days, for the 8th day would be coming, and on that 8th day, by Yom HaShmini, there'd be a dedication of the Mishkan when God's presence would rest in the tabernacle. In other words, the 7 days of isolation was meant to protect the Kohanim from any of these outside threats. And when we think to the Pesach story, when we think to Pesach Mitzrayim, to the very, very first Seder in Egypt, I think we find a very similar idea. The Torah tells us that after we sprinkle the blood on the lintel and the doorpost, Atem lo tetzu ish mipetach beito ad boker, that nobody should go outside the door of their home on Pesach night until morning. And you know why? Do you know what's outside? It's danger. Ve'avar Hashem lingof et Mitzrayim. Outside of that door, it's not safe because God is punishing the Egyptians and killing all the firstborns. There is a magefa. There is a plague that is going on outside and we can't leave. We need to stay inside because it's the only place that's safe. And we say, Ma'aseh avot siman labanim. History repeats itself. And we too, today, we need to heed God's words as well. But perhaps we can look at all of this from a different perspective. When we think about that first Pesach in the home that took place in Egypt, Pesach Mitzrayim, there's something else that stands out that I think maybe even adds a deeper meaning to our current experience. You know, there's a very simple question that we have to ask about that first Pesach. We know that the Jewish people had a Korban Pesach. We know that they had a Paschal offering. But where did they sacrifice it? In fact, if we look carefully, there are many similarities between the first Korban Pesach and other sacrifices in general. For instance, the Korban Olah, like the Korban Pesach, comes from an unblemished, male sheep. Similarly, there's the idea of notar, that we need to burn, that we need to destroy all the leftover meat from the Paschal offering in the same way that we do with the regular korban, with the regular sacrifice. And yet, we know of no altars in Egypt. And so the Gemara in Pesachim teaches us that on that first Pesach, the entire home actually turned into a mizbeach. Much like an altar, we also sprinkled blood, but this time on the doorposts instead of the karnot hamizbeach. The very notion of an altar itself as a place of protection which belongs to God, such that one has no right to harm somebody at that site. It's a place of protection. In fact, we see this idea play out itself on two different occasions in Tanakh, when somebody attempts to save himself from execution by clinging to the corners of the altar. And in Egypt, the home, this makeshift mizbeach provides protection from the Jewish people. And this actually helps us understand something else remarkable. While we're probably spending all of this time cleaning our homes, we're getting it ready by removing all of the chametz, Pesach is actually not the only time that we don't have chametz. In fact, none of the sacrifices, none of the korbanos that were offered on the mizbeach in the temple, except on Shavuos, none of them had any chametz. In fact, one of the ways in which we make the mikdash special is that you can only have matzah in that space. You can't have chametz. We don't allow chametz into our homes on Pesach because our homes are like the mizbeach. They are altars. And more than that, when we look carefully throughout the entire story of this first Seder, time and again, we see a very specific word being used over and over and over throughout the whole narrative. And it's the word bayit. Lo tetzu ish mipatach beito. We shouldn't leave our homes. Shivat yamim sor lo yimatzeh bebatechem. For 7 days, we shouldn't have any leaven in our homes. The blood is described as an ot al habatim. It's described as a sign for the homes. We say ein bayit asher ein sham meit. Every home had within it someone that died. We need a sela bayit. We need a lamb for every single home. And over again in the story of Pesach, we see this emphasis on the home. And in fact, all other times of the year, we focus on the temple. We focus on the Beis HaMikdash. But here and now, on Pesach, the korban is instructed to be eaten in the home, on this mizbeach, because the home is the central motif of the Passover experience. We learn from Pesach that Judaism is not just lived in the holiest of places, in our shuls, in our sanctuaries, in our temples, but it is lived in our homes as well. The first microcosmic parallel to the Beis HaMikdash itself, it's not shuls or yeshivas, but rather it's the common, ubiquitous, often underappreciated Jewish home. And it's for good reason. Because no matter what a yeshiva or a school can teach us out of the home, no matter what a shul can facilitate and can reinforce, we see with our own eyes, over and over again, that the power of what transpires, of what inspires within a Jewish home is entirely unparalleled. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, in a beautiful piece on our Parsha, he writes that perhaps the Kohanim are not socially distancing and quarantining themselves from danger from the outside, as much as they're trying to focus their energy and their attention on creating something on the inside. Much like when a person dedicates themselves inwards to building their home as a Bayit Ne'eman B'Yisrael, such that their home transforms into this mizbeach, so too this is what the Kohanim are being asked and charged with doing in our Parsha. Because they can go out on that 8th day and dedicate the temple and become officially Kohanim, but before they can do that, they themselves, they need to look inwards. They need to create sanctity by being enveloped in the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, for an entire week. It's not a fear of the outside, but rather it's the opportunity to immerse oneself in a holy environment. Friends, we have been forced to leave our holy places. We have even been forced to separate from each other, to be apart for Seder, and for many of us, this will be the first and hopefully the only Pesach that we ever have to be alone. But this moment has created a unique opportunity for each of us, no matter what our circumstances might be this year. A unique opportunity to turn our homes into holy spaces in new and creative ways. So let us use this time, as we are now more oriented towards our homes inwardly like the Kohanim and the Jewish people in Egypt, to appreciate how holy and special a Jewish home really is. Let us see the opportunity in front of us on this Shabbat and on this Pesach to fill our homes with davening, with Torah learning, with shalom, so that please God, when all of this is over, and let it be over soon, we will not only regain the sanctuary in our shul, but the sanctity of the Jewish home, and ultimately the return of the Mikdash, the return of our ability to offer sacrifices in the Holy Temple that we've all waited for way, way too long. And so Orit and Shaya and Nava and Noam, they join me in wishing all of you and your families a Shabbat Shalom, a peaceful, a relaxing, and a meaningful Shabbat, and a Chag Kasher v'Sameach.